Hey guys! So I received a few of you have additional questions related to SDLC or basically change management, how acquisition happens, what's the process of changing software. So I'm decided to do a quick video on the main high points over there. And I'm not gonna go too much in detail in this video, but I just want to give you a very high overview on how this process works and which areas are the ones that you should be paying more attention, because once you're reading the manual, there's a lot of processes over there that sometimes are just more for an understanding, but not necessarily something that an IS auditor needs to know or are part of the audit. Let me give you an example. I know that we're going to be talking about software and everything, but one of the best examples that I can think of that I've seen a lot of new IS auditors usually getting confused when they go out in the field and perform an audit is related to a user access review. A user access review is basically when management review a list of users and the roles of a specific system to make sure that those users have the appropriate access. So usually when you talk and perform like walkthroughs with those managers, they tell you, hey, this is what they are doing, this is how they evaluate those users are appropriate, this is the list of users, this is how they know if those users are appropriate or not. Usually these are the managers of those people, so they know them very close and they know what type of access they actually need in the system to perform their job duties. Now, as an IS auditor, that's good to know, but what usually happens is that you receive that list of users and you start going one by one and trying to reperform what this manager have done. You're trying to basically go with the first person, let's say John Smith, have role A, B, and C. So you go over there and see John Smith have role A, B, and C, and you say, okay, it looks appropriate. Well, first of all, that's a really, really bad reperformance because you don't know anything about John Smith, you don't know who he actually is, you don't know what his job duties. So in overall, you could not even tell if role A, B, and C is appropriate for that user to have. So what you should be doing is actually evaluating what management is doing. Remember, the function of the IS auditor is to make sure that management or the company by itself is following their own standards, procedures, and guidelines. So if the guideline says that the manager have to get a list of all the users from system A that should contain roles A, B, and C, which will be the guidelines and all the details on those procedures, that's where you should be evaluating. And you should look, okay, did the manager actually pull the list from system A? Is that list complete and accurate? What are some of the steps that the manager did that are documented audit evidence that will tell you that, hey, he actually performed a review? It's not that he just scroll to the end of the Excel file or print it out and go to the last page and sign off, because that's really easy. But how do we know how they can prove to us that they actually performed a review? And our audit control, what we should be doing is to make sure that the manager is following those processes. Now, definitely I mentioned that's totally outside from development and software changes, but that comes to a good example of what to look for over here. The book have really good examples, really good details on what are some of the areas on basically an SLDC. What type of testings do you have? You have unit testing, regression testing. You have multiple things over there. Who should be over there? It talks a lot about project management, making sure that the project is in alignment with the financial objectives, with corporate objectives, with business objectives. And it talks a lot about the entire process of changing or acquiring software. But you have to remember, the IS auditor is not going to reperform all of that. What it's going to look for is what are the standards, procedures, and guidelines that management or the company used in order to make a change or in order to acquire a system or to build out something from scratch or coding it, to make sure that they're following up their company's procedures, standards, and guidelines. And that's where basically we have to make sure we have and we go with those lenses, because a lot of the questions are going to be in that lens. There's not going to be questions on, oh, tell me what's phase number 4 of the SDLC. There's not going to be a question from that perspective. What it's going to tell is what's the risk when something like that happen on an SDLC process. So with that, let's go over here. I'm going to share my screen, and I draw over here a few things just to make sure we're in the same page. So let's read just this DLC phase. So let me make this one a little bit smaller so it's easier to read. So definitely we have 6 phases in any type of SDLC process. The first one is the feasibility of a study, making sure that whatever thing you're going to develop or you're going to acquire is actually feasible and is going to solve any type of business problem, or is going to help the business to, let's say, either be more faster, make more profit, sales, etc. After that, you have to make sure you have your requirements. Make sure that, hey, you understand what entitles to either purchase that software or develop by your own self. If you are developing, do you have enough coders? Do they know all the systems, technology, and things in order to develop that system? Or if you are acquiring, from whom you are acquiring, is that a respectable company? Do they have a SOC report? That's very important. Do they have any other type of security configurations or anything depending on what the system is entitled to do? And then definitely the third one is the selection of the software and acquisition if you're purchasing something, or definitely the design of the software if it's being developed in-house. Fourth one will be the configuration of that software if it's purchased, or definitely the development of that software if you're developing in-house. Finally, we do a final testing and make sure that we implement that software. And after that, very, very important, make sure that we do a post-implementation, basically making sure that the entire process of the system went well and everything was already tested and the system is working as expected. Now that we already know the phases, let's come over here and let's take a look more what the IS Auditor role is, or how I like to call it, the review process. Because again, you are not reperforming the requirements, you're not reperforming the design or the configuration or the development or the final testing or the post-implementation. What you are doing, you are reviewing that the company is following up those phases and they're considering the risks and rewards of each of the phases, because you're never gonna be able to cover 100% of the risks. You have to make sure that the company understands this is the entire universe of risks. These are the risks that they're covering, and this is what is not being covered, and they know that they're comfortable and good with not covering those risks. Now let's go over here into the IS Auditor role. So definitely, if you think about what type of things you're gonna be reviewing, from a project management perspective, most of the cases you're gonna look for, okay, what are the levels of oversight? What's the risk management methods? Meaning what I was talking before, what level of risk management decided to take on this project and what's the risk that is unleft, and making sure that's documented and understood throughout the entire management and the company. Issues management, cost management, process for planning, making sure that the entire process was planned correctly, because if it's not planned correctly, you're going to be facing, or the company is going to be facing, a lot of delays and then over budgets, and then basically the process will be more expensive. What's the reporting process? Making sure that they know what phases the project will cover and how they're going to be reporting. Change control process, meaning that they have a process to make changes on the code or the configurations as they are also developing. Make sure that the stakeholders are very involved in this project. They need to make sure that they understand all the implications from the project from beginning to end. So if there's any slippages or anything in between, they are very well aware and involved to make changes as needed. Definitely the sign up for the process, making sure the appropriate management knows about the project and you basically, or the company basically, signs off on that and basically assign all the resources needed to develop this software. Then additionally of that, the IS auditor will also perform some documentation evaluation, for example, what are the business objectives, what are some of the deliverables, the project schedule, and basically the economic forecast. Again, this is a review that covers most of the project management. But again, the IS auditor is further than project management, is further than the economics, is further than the project schedule. It also includes what's IT. So for that, we need to think about it. What are the risks? Every time that I think about something like a control, a process, or anything that I'm going to be auditing, I always ask this question: what is the risk behind? Because you could be going in many different places as you talk with a lot of people, and you realize that you could perform an audit on something that may not be relevant, may not be covering the risk. At the end of the day, you have to make sure that you are covering the risk, and it's not your risk as an IS auditor risk, it's the risk of the company that they may not have the good process and they may be missing on a high risk perspective, and management should know and be aware of that. So let's say, for example, you are developing, or the company is developing a piece of software, and they totally forgot about the security, so they don't have username or passwords, or if they have it, it's very weak, so anyone can guess it. You have guest accounts over here, so they didn't thought about security, but the program is working very well. Well, there's a huge risk over there. Let's say that the program have social security information, date of birth, have people's names. So all this information that you should making sure as a company that is well protected. Well, the IS auditor goes over there and evaluates the entire process to make sure all those areas are being addressed. And if something is not addressed, make sure that management knows that there's a risk over there and they sign off on that risk, saying yes, management and the company assumes that risk because of any different factors. It could be that it's too expensive compared to what the risk is, etc. So what are the risks that we should be thinking about in SDLC from an IT perspective? Well, the first one is either unintentional or intentional misconfigurations or malicious code. Basically, the person that have access to the configuration if it's purchased, or the person who have access to code, could intentionally or unintentionally add something over there that could be malicious. It could be either stealing email addresses, stealing personal information, stealing credit card information, who knows, depending on what the system is doing. So you have to make sure that you have controls in place to address that risk. Second one, results are not complete and accurate. Let's say the system is already in place and everything, but they forgot to test everything or do a thrill testing on how the system behaves. Well, if it's coded and everything, basically the programmer, the coder, is the one who knows how exactly the system works or that piece of code that they wrote. But what happens if something in between is working funny and at the end of the day, let's say it's a calculation and the calculation is not being calculated correctly? Well, now the company is going to be using numbers that are not complete, that they're not accurate. So definitely that's a huge risk that the company needs to make sure is being addressed. So what are some of the standards, process, procedures, guidelines that the company have through their SDLC process to make sure that something like that is not happening? Part of that will be testing their implementation, making sure that development is tested through multiple scenarios. It's not just recursive testing, it's not just a unit testing. You have to test every single scenario on the entitlement of that software. Transactional data can be manipulated, not just about the code perspective. Where is all this information being stored on a database? Well, making sure that that information is well protected, because it could be that everything is working perfectly, but someone or everyone have access to a database and could change that information and that data. They don't even have to go through the application, they go directly into the data. Make sure that that's also well protected. So the IS auditor will check on what controls the company have to make sure that that information is protected and only accessible for those ones who really need that access. Changes were performed with malicious intent or benefit, very similar to the first one, saying, hey, what happens if the person who's coding for some reason gets mad at the company or anything, and rather than being malicious, put something over there that benefits him? What happens if, for example, he put a piece of code that is depositing like 2 cents for every transaction into his bank account? Well, if it's 2 cents or 1 cent or half a cent, probably is not even visible from a transactional perspective. But what happens if there's thousands of transactions every single day? Well, that bank account definitely is gonna grow up. So you have to make sure, or the company have to make sure, that they have processes in place to make sure that every single aspect of code or changes or configurations that are going into the production system are being not just evaluated, but also everyone is aware about those changes. They have sign-offs and management is well aware what those changes are. So overall, we have to think about those risks. Again, if you read the manual, you will have a lot of information, and that's very useful because it gives us some context on how everything is working. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we look everything from a lenses of an IS auditor and not from a lenses of management, the company, or the programmer or the coder who's doing all of these processes. Now, finally, let's go over here to things that we need to think about. Let me actually move this one a little bit so we have side by side. So what are some of the things to think about it in terms of controls? Because remember, the controls are the processes that are in place in a company to make sure the risks are mitigated. So how can we mitigate some of these risks? Definitely with controls related to access security. And I put it over here on a very, very high level because if you look at the book, they have very, very detailed, and I didn't have too much space over here, and we will spend just an hour to go through all of those details. So on a very high level, access security means anyone who have an account on the system to be appropriate. As we already talked at the beginning of this video, user access reviews. That's part of access security. Provisioning, terminations, passwords, all of these ones are typical controls that you will find over there. Now, testing. Testing is very, very important before testing and after testing. After means after it has been already implemented and users are being used. You have to also make sure that you're performing some level of testing to make sure everything is working as expected. Now, testing is very important. We already talked about either intentional or unintentional misconfigurations. That could easily be solved when you have a really good and strong testing mechanisms and procedures. Segregation of duties or SOD, making sure that the person who's doing the code is restricted and cannot do the entire flow. That's one of the biggest risks of development in software, is that the coder is able to go through the entire transaction and push the code all the way into production. With that, basically there's no oversight. The coder could just go over there in the middle of the night without anyone seeing him and make a change in the code that may benefit him. And no one in the company will know because there is no segregation. There's no one who's actually looking at that piece of code to either test it or approve it or anything from a system perspective. You have to make sure that you have enough people in place that creates that segregation of duties. Management awareness and buy-off. Definitely you have to make sure that management is aware of what changes are being performed in the system, and you have, or the company have, the buy-off from them. I've seen many cases that they just go ahead, push a change, and management was not aware of the change, and potentially those changes could impact how management is relying on the system. That's why that's really, really important. With that, I hope you enjoyed this quick video. I think I talked about like 20 minutes on SDLC. Very high level. I didn't want to go too much in details. I mean, the manual already have a lot of details. What I tried to explain over here are more what are some of the high level perspectives, some of the risks, some of the things that you have to think about it from an IS auditor perspective. Remember, the CISA exam is going to test you how good you are thinking as an IS auditor, not how good you are at understanding how SDLC works. So with that, I hope these questions help you. And if you have any more questions or anything that is not clear over here, definitely let me know. We are part of this group over here, so you can put more comments below this video. Ask me any questions. If you have any other thoughts about SDLC, or if there's any areas that I forgot to cover or maybe was not clear, let me know. I will try to explain that as much as I can. With that, we'll see you on the next video.